very much for the invitation to speak to all of you. It's really a pleasure, despite it being in this unfortunate virtual format, which, however, has the advantage of at least allowing us to connect across borders and across the 50 different countries that Violetta mentioned. I think that's a position of privilege. I will start by just recalling that although I'm the European Commission spokesperson, I don't always speak on behalf of the institution. I occasionally have the pleasure and privilege to also be able to share my own experience as a civil servant and as somebody who's working at the junction of policy and communication in the migration area. And that is what I will do with you today. So please don't take what I say as the official position of my employer, but merely as some reflections and food for thought from a personal perspective. Now, we're going to talk about the role of media in shaping public opinion and policies on migration. And the handbook that is the occasion for our discussions today is really mainly destined for journalists. But I've seen that a lot of us present in the meeting today are from many different horizons, including also policymakers or academics. And I'm of course speaking more from a position of someone working in communications and in policy, and therefore that will also be my sort of target audience in what I'm going to say. And really, my pitch will be very simple and could be resumed as saying that the role of the media on policies is extremely important, and it's something that is really, really worth paying attention to. And I will try to unpack a little bit why and how, in my experience, in our work here in the Commission, we're trying to approach this and make these links a little bit more operational and make sure that we actually use our understanding of the links to further the policy objectives that we all share. So I'll start maybe by unpacking a little bit the concept of public perception of migration, because I think it's a striking fact that many, if not most people in our countries actually don't have any direct experience of migration. They have some idea about migration, but they don't have a direct experience. And often, actually, paradoxically, even when they do have a direct experience, they don't even see it that way, particularly here in the European Union. I personally, I grew up in a small village in northwestern Poland, and most of the people I have, or many of the people I have grown up with, left the village and went to work in many different member states of the EU. But when you ask them about migration, they say, "Oh, what migration? No, I have nothing to do with that." They see their experience as something completely different, as free movement within the EU, and that is perfectly fine. But it contributes a little bit to this interesting paradox. So so people don't really have this direct experience, and even if they do, it tends to be a very partial experience. You know, either they have met somebody who is a refugee or a migrant, but then it's going to be one specific person, or and then of course their experience will be defined by what kind of a person it was, a good person, maybe a bad person, depending on how close they feel to that person. So we can't really rely on people's direct experience to understand the public opinion on migration. And in fact, because migration is not this kind of real object that you can touch and experience yourself so much, I see migration much more as a political object. It exists to the extent it's politicized, it's described, it's talked about, but not something that you can touch. Now, how is this political object created? It is created to some extent by what people live and what people see and how they interpret their experience as maybe a consequence of migration or an aspect of migration. That is, of course, created by policy, which is key. But I think most importantly, it is created by what people see and read in the media and on social media more and more these days. In terms of migration, this the media and what's on the internet don't only create perceptions and people's public opinion, but also in our policy, the link between these perceptions and what is written and policy is particularly strong, more so I think than in other areas. Why am I saying that? It's because the language and the descriptions that are used in the framing often embody and carry in themselves very strongly policies and policy solutions. I'll give you an example. Recently, we've had situations where, because of geopolitical developments, we had lots of people, or a certain a higher number than usual of people arriving at the border of one of our member states. And I've seen reports on this, framing this as a sudden influx of illegal immigrants at the border. Now, of course, if you see things like that, if something is illegal and if something is a threat, then the logical policy solution to this is to treat these people as criminals, as a threat, but detain them, push them back, and essentially see it as a fundamental security threat. Now, that is not necessarily the most obvious framing. You could also see it as an issue of people being caught up in a geopolitical situation, and therefore potentially rather needing protection and security, and this geopolitical issue being addressed differently through other channels. So just by, in one sentence, describing the situation, you essentially bring in immediately a policy solution. And that's, I think, something that's very specific to our policy. And that means that when, as policymakers, we speak about migration, we have to be extremely careful that our policy messages and and how we express them is completely coherent, because otherwise you end up saying things that you just don't want to say, or you say things that are not completely coherent. Now, the challenge for us as communicators now, so working with the policy people on communication, is how to actually make this happen. And changing or trying to influence public opinion and public perceptions through communication essentially has two aspects for me. One is the aspect of what do you say? So what do you present to other people? And then the second aspect is how it lands, how it gets understood by people. Now, I will start maybe by talking about what we say and how we say it, because that's what's most easy to influence. But I will also say a couple of words about the other aspect, about how it ends up landing in people's heads. So when it comes to what we say as institutional communicators, there is, of course, the issue of content. So I think that's kind of basic communication knowledge, that you have to have a clear message and you need to be able to articulate it properly. But of course, the more difficult aspect is the question of language and of framing, and how you say things can end up obscuring the content of what you want to say. And when it comes to making sure that an institution or a government or anyone, in fact, has a clear message that doesn't obscure, which is communicated in a way that doesn't obscure what you want to say, there are, again, there is an essential thing that you have to put in place across your institution, and that is message discipline. This is, for me, challenge number one for any institution communicating on migration. What is message discipline? It's really just making sure that anyone who is producing anything that gets through to the public is using similar terms that embody the policy messages that you want to use, that everyone understands the context in which things are said, and that people try to avoid, to the extent possible, in anything that goes to the outside, policy jargon. Why? Because policy jargon tends to be very simplifying. It tends to assume a lot of things and leaves a lot of things unsaid. Whereas, unfortunately, when it comes to public communications, you have to keep contextualizing And you have to repeat again and again what is the overall big picture on migration policies, because we are working against perceptions that are very entrenched and that are often very simplified in people's heads. And people don't necessarily have the kind of full picture that we may have as policymakers. So message discipline is really key, and that is a management challenge as opposed to a communications challenge. But that's why I think it's so important to be able to to internally in our institutions be able to tell people that these things matter. And this is how tools like the handbook are extremely useful and relevant, not only to journalists, but also in our internal work as policymakers. Now, on message discipline, in addition to just being very pushy with internal work and having tools such as the handbook, it is also really important to have a strategic approach. And what I mean by this is essentially that it is a worthwhile investment to sit down at some point and try to articulate a very broad picture of how the overall policy objectives of your organizations fit into a communication strategy and a specific language, so that then when you apply message discipline to colleagues, they can hang it onto an existing strategy. So just to give you an example of how this works, in the European Commission, we have realized that we have to move away from a communications perspective, away from a narrative of we are in a migration crisis, we have to manage this crisis, and it is all extremely difficult for everyone, onto a different policy, a policy where we're trying to find a sustainable European migration management system, which hangs upon the idea that migration is a normal thing and that European migration is possible, and it's something that we can do if we work together, and that migration management is about working with human beings as opposed to just flows and numbers. And having articulated this kind of basic sets of messages, we then are able to hang all the different developments that are happening and how we talk about them onto this overall narrative. And so, for example, when there is a problem somewhere, we try not to say things like, this is a crisis, this is an emergency, but to say, yes, there are difficulties there, but we have to address them. And here is what we can do to actually make this happen. But it's a very different message. Having this strategic approach and an overall reflection enables us then to push through a measure of discipline with our colleagues. And again, this is an issue where tools like the handbook are extremely useful to be able to articulate, design this strategic approach, having all the different aspects and context in mind, because that's where I think the handbook also excels in providing us with a full picture, very well researched, of all the different aspects. And finally, a last thing that I wanted to say is coming back to the issue of how what we say ends up landing with people. Because, of course, what policymakers say doesn't arrive to people directly. It arrives often, or most of the time, via an intermediary. Of course, when people see something that we as policy making institutions post on social media, then it's direct. But even then, people see it as institutional communication, and they don't necessarily approach it with as much openness as when they see it from other intermediaries. The key intermediary there is the media. And of course, there are lots and lots of very different types of media. And it is in the politicized domain such as migration, you have a lot of media outlets that have a specific agenda and that are not necessarily receptive to changing their mind, because they come with a specific objective. And there is very little that we as policymakers can do working with those media, because they know exactly what they want to say. However, there is the public opinion is luckily to a large extent still shaped by what I could call quality media. So quality media that really seek to understand the reality and report in a responsible way about what is happening and what the policy developments are. I think something that policymakers don't often realize is just how hard the work of these responsible media is, and how much support they need from us in order to be able to report properly. And this support means a lot of different things. It means that we need to be able to supply them with quality information and data very rapidly. We need to be open to discussing with those media in a very open way, in a very honest way, what are the challenges and difficulties of that we face as policymakers. And very importantly, we have to have a consistent, clear message to these media, which again comes back to message discipline and a strategic approach to what we do. And this, again, and I will finish on that, is where the handbook is such a useful tool, because in the very difficult work of the media, it gives also the journalists a base of knowledge about the content and the framing of migration that they can use then in order to be able to interrogate this policy better and then to report in a balanced way that supports good policies. And this is why I'm so happy that this project exists, and I'm so grateful for initiating it, and to the governments that have supported it financially. I think this is really a great investment, and I very much hope that it will be used a lot and developed further. I, from my side, will definitely continue spreading awareness of its existence and pointing people to it. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to the rest of the event.
Well, hello, thank you very much. It's extremely nice to have an opportunity to speak to so many people, and fantastic to follow Adalbert, whose insights, I think, have been extremely helpful, extremely informative, and very much. So let me just firstly introduce myself a little bit. As Violetta already explained, I'm the Deputy Director at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a minute. And I'm, as she also pointed out, a former journalist. So I worked for about 10 years as a reporter for newspapers in the UK. So I have direct experience of the realities of actually producing news content. I wasn't a specialist in migration in those days, and I think that that's quite important here because the vast majority of journalists are not. Anyway, so just to quickly explain a little bit about my role at the Migration Observatory and what the Migration Observatory is. And it's not to be confused, obviously, with the Prague Process Migration Observatory, which obviously similarly named and does similar sorts of things. But we are the UK's sort of preeminent migration analysis program, and we're based at the University of Oxford. And our objective is to inform policymakers, media, and civil society. So the work that we do there is very, very closely aligned to the kinds of things that we've been trying to do with the handbook as well. And a lot of it's about kind of trying to make sure that public debate and that and the policy making and media are built around accurate as far as possible information and an understanding of what that sort of information means. And so this is something that we've tried to put at the heart of the handbook that we've produced as well. Just to be clear, we're part of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oxford, but particularly part of a thing called the Centre on Migration, Policy and Society. So enough about me. Let me tell you a little bit more about the handbook. So the first question is what actually is it? What does it do? Because I'm sure that an awful lot of the people who are currently on this this webinar haven't actually seen it yet. So the first thing is that it is detailed content about reporting on migration, and it's designed for journalists and students. And when I say detailed content, I mean this is around about 200 pages long. Now that may seem slightly intimidating. Obviously, there's a lot of content there, but it's designed to be used in a very, very straightforward way. You can dip in and out. You don't actually have to read it from start to finish. It's all very clearly signposted the whole way through. So the idea is that anybody who's doing anything about migration in a media context, whether they're doing it for study or whether they're doing it actually as a working journalist, and that's really where we primarily aim this, should be able to pick it up and actually get some sort of understanding of some of the complexities of the issues that they're dealing with, explained in a way which is very practical and designed to assist them in their day-to-day work as a reporter. So the sorts of things that it deals with, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, is the kind of terminology that gets used. What are the issues with that terminology? Why do we use the language that we use? What are the problems with some of that language? There's obviously, we have concerns about the loading particular words and adding meaning to things that maybe seem to be they seem to be neutral, but actually realistically we know that they potentially wave a flag that may indicate something else. It deals with law, and both international law and sort of things like the Refugee Convention and various things that govern the way that states manage migration, but also the kind of interactions between national law and international law, and the ways that these things are enforced, and what that can potentially mean as well. So dealing with that sort of thing. Obviously, we deal with data in some detail. I will come back to that a little bit more later. We look quite consistently throughout the whole book at the ethics of what people might be doing. Now, we don't go in trying to tell people how they should think about the issue of migration, whether they should be pro-liberal migration policies or pro-restrictive migration policies or anything like that, because we also understand that media and policy are complex things that come from a number of different positions on things. But we try to actually underline everything that we've done with a kind of assessment of what may be the ethical considerations within those issues. We provide practical tips for people about how to do certain things, where you might find the best information, the kinds of things that will actually make it easier for you to get your story and to do it properly, and also not make mistakes or slip into tropes or ordinary ways of doing things that actually are potentially misleading. We provide a sort of a suite of key contacts. This particular piece of work has been done with a few countries specifically in mind, but it's quite international. I'll come back to that in a second as well. But so it helps people to actually identify where key contacts might be and what key contacts might provide in different kinds of contexts. So, for example, when one might want to speak to an academic, when one might want to speak to a policymaker, a civil society member, and obviously migrants themselves within this sort of context. So it deals with a large range of different things. I'm going to go through the kind of chapter headings later on so that you can see the sorts of directions that we go in. As I was saying before, the content, while it's been designed for the MOMENTA project, which was obviously focused on a group of of post-Soviet countries, the actual realities of of what's in the handbook is that it's not particularly specific to the locations, because at the end of the day, migration stories, migration narratives, the kind of concepts and ideas that we interact with, while they may have specific national or regional sort of contexts and perspectives, they tend to be fairly universal. So the handbook actually can be picked up and used by pretty much anybody to provide information and analysis. Maybe not so great on some of the key contacts if you're not in Georgia or Azerbaijan or Armenia or Moldova or Ukraine, but nevertheless, for the general kind of themes and content, there is an enormous amount of information that's applicable to anybody anywhere. And I would say as well, one of the real benefits of the modern world is that there's a degree of interactivity to the handbook as well, with a lot of links to video content, journalists talking about the kind of work that they do, and some leading international journalists, people from the BBC, the New York Times, and various other publications actually explaining their rationale and their way of doing certain things within the reporting of migration. And as you already know, this is part of MOMENTA 2, and which deals specifically with those issues that I've just listed. But it's also, as we say, I mean, it's something which is applicable to pretty much any environment. And as Violetta's also pointed out, this is funded by the German Federal Foreign Office, to whom we are extremely grateful. So let me talk a little bit, and I know Adalbert has given us a pretty impressive kind of outline of why it's really important to have good quality migration reporting and the role that that plays in policy making, why a handbook like this is useful for policymakers as well as journalists and all of that kind of thing. But I'd like to just kind of identify as well a little bit about the fact that this is not trying to change the way that people have done things in the past, but it's trying to actually recognize that the concepts and themes that sit behind modern migration reporting are part of the story of humanity, and that they always have been. And that ever since there has been any form of media, there's been stories in there about migration. I'm sure, I believe that we have a few participants from Azerbaijan at the moment who would probably recognize the petroglyph that we have in this photograph here, which is an image of a boat from Gobustan National Park, which is believed to date back to about 10,000 BC. And this is a depiction of people moving. Now, I have to stand up and say that I can't tell you for certain that that's a depiction of people migrating. It may be people fishing, or it may be people going to war or something. But irrespective of that, it's a picture of human mobility in one form or another. And we can even look at what the other image that we have on the screen here, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is obviously kind of highlighting the fact that as soon as we have any kind of written history, we have stories about migration. These things underpin the Abrahamic religions, the story of the Exodus, the story of Jesus's flight to the desert, the story of the Hajira of Muhammad. These are common themes, the mobility of people, and the themes that we see in modern newspaper reporting or news reporting or online tend to follow similar themes to the themes that we've seen throughout history in a depiction of mobility of people. And those are things like group identity, the us and the other and otherness, the them. It's things like the religious, cultural, and ethnic distinctions between communities. It's things like land ownership and territorial rights. It's issues of conflict over resources or power. And also it's issues such as just even more abstract ideas, like the idea of the exotic versus the normal, you know? And so these themes are important. And I think that in terms of actually understanding that these are standard ways that people interpret the mobility of people and have done for centuries, for millennia even, I think that we have to recognize that to some extent that the reporting of migration needs to move beyond this a little bit. We need to recognize that while these kinds of stories and ways that we have of interpreting the world are commonplace, it's also important that we actually recognize that they are sort of built into sort of narrative structures about the way that people operate, and that we can interrogate those and actually think about whether or not when we try to tell a complete story about migration, whether we're just slipping into traps about reporting. So one of the things that we tried to do in the book is to break things down and provide complex, detailed information that people can step into and understand whether or not the stories that they're telling about migration are actually just part of ongoing sort of narratives that exist and have existed for thousands of years, or whether they are actually seriously investigating the points that they need to get into and that they need to deal with properly. Yeah. So one of the other key things that we need to recognize is that the issue of migration is complex. Reporters, as I highlighted before, I mean, as a reporter, I wasn't a specialist, and the vast majority of reporters do not specialize in the issue of migration. There's a very, very small number who specialize in migration. And so as a result of that, they have to do what reporters always have to do, which is to learn on the job very, very quickly. And in order to be able to do that, to have solid resources which provide them with access to the way that they can tell these stories effectively is extremely important. And to provide that clarity is key. So Please forgive me, my computer is misbehaving slightly. So one of the things that we provide in the handbook is these simple technical explanations for what's going on and why it's happening. So even understanding the difference between immigration, emigration, and net migration, for example, is important, because the statistics that people are presented with can mean that they end up using a figure incorrectly, and that can create a completely incorrect public conception of what is going on. So basic things like explaining the technicalities of how migration works, we do, and we do it in straightforward and accessible terms. As I mentioned before, the way that language is used can create understanding of how something is that is actually sort of implicit in the words that are provided. So the language terminology can be loaded in ways that can mean that people understand things fundamentally differently. If we even think about the term migrant, since about 2013, 14, certainly 2015, the term migrant, certainly in English language news, has come to mean more and more an alternative to a refugee, often depicted as somebody who is undocumented and doesn't have rights. So the term migrant can in itself, while it's ostensibly a neutral term, can be used to imply irregularity or undeservingness. So just actually interrogating the language that's being used and understanding the implications of it is very, very important. We try to articulate the fact that simplistic policy solutions can be very problematic, and that you need to understand that where a policy is being put forward, you need to think about what the implications of it might be, what the trade-offs that policy might introduce might mean. Because journalists obviously play a substantial role in identifying for the public what kind of policy responses, as Adalbert was saying, should be taken. Now, one of the things that people really need to grasp is that almost nothing will not generate some sort of trade-off. And so from that point of view, it's extremely important that we try to actually highlight where these sorts of things might happen, where, for example, there may be economic implications of a social policy change, or social implications rather of an economic policy change, where the implications of a more liberal or a more restrictive migration policy might roll over into business, or might roll over into the education sector, or whatever. So trying to just articulate how these things work. We also look a little bit at the working practices of journalists, and we think about how the day-to-day realities of working in a newsroom might affect the way that people actually operate and the choices that they make to do certain things. So I personally have done a lot of work looking at the reporting practices of journalists dealing with the issue of migration. And as such, it's become clear that often the goodwill that people have, the high expectations that they have of their own working practices can be eroded, or even just norms can be introduced that mean that people slip into a sort of lazy shorthand in the way that they end up reporting on things. They don't want to do this. Almost every reporter that we interviewed for a project I did a little while ago, which was about 200 reporters around the EU, they all identified that their desire was to make the world a better place through their reporting, that they wanted to do good things with what they were trying to achieve. They weren't malevolent, they weren't highly politically motivated. But the day-to-day reality of working in a news environment can affect the way that you report on things. So we've tried to address a little bit about that as well. So the working practices of individual journalists in specific beats, dealing with specific areas. As I mentioned before, we deal with laws and ethics, and we explain the concepts that underpin these laws and the implementation of these policies. Sorry, I've just jumped on a little bit too fast there. But yeah, so, and then moving on to, I mean, this is really just reiterating the point that Adalbert was making earlier on, which is that accurate and ethical journalism is key to informed and open societies generally, and specifically that journalism affects public attitudes and that often shapes policy outcomes. But equally, that policy outcomes can affect media, which can then affect public attitudes. There is an interaction of all of these issues. Now, one of the things to bear in mind here is that migration is commonly used to try to affect political opinion. So migration can be a tool used to try to guide people towards support for one particular political party, for example. And we've seen this certainly over the last 5 years quite commonly happening. And so one of the things that we try to do in the handbook is to actually identify how and why this sort of thing might be being done, so that people can interrogate it a little bit and make sure that they're dealing with things in a way which means that they're not being, as journalists, they're not being used unwittingly as tools to try and push people towards a particular political position. Now, obviously, it's up to the journalist if they want to do such a thing, but nevertheless, to recognize how and why that might be being done is extremely important. Migration is super complicated. I mean, it's simple on one hand, you know, people move from one place to another and people either like it or they don't like it, but it's super complicated in the array of impacts that it can generate, the positives and the negatives. And often migration reporters simply lack an understanding of the complexity of these things and end up reporting on things in a one-dimensional way purely because they simply don't know the information about how these things might work otherwise. I'm conscious that I'm taking rather a long time here, so I better move on quickly. But society as a whole benefits from a better understanding of migration issues in the media. And so, I mean, I think that we have a strong argument that the handbook, if used effectively, can help to ensure we have stronger and better informed societies. Now, I won't spend too long on this, but what I can say about the handbook is that one of the things that we found is that both in sending countries and in receiving countries, primarily migrant sending countries and primarily migrant receiving countries, the tendency towards reporting on migration is to deal with it in a negative way. And one of the factors in that is that it's often depicted as only one part of migration which is considered. Adalbert alluded to this earlier on. When we think about migration in the context of people, of ourselves, we tend, I mean, often in Europe in particular, people don't think of themselves as having necessarily migrated as such. But the reality is that we will often use the term migration to think about the mobility of the poor in society generally. And so from that point of view, we try to make sure that there's an understanding of the multiple different facets of migration. That sports reporting, when dealing with the transfer of international football players, is dealing with migration. That high-level business people relocating to another country in order to set up a wing of their firm, these are migrants. In the same way that people arriving at a border, well, maybe not quite in the same way, but in a similar way, that the way that people arriving at a border in desperate straits are also migrants. These are people moving from one place to another in a complex series of national environments. So, as I say, so one of the things we try to do is ensure that we are dealing with things in the most neutral way possible. We're not telling people how they should report on things. We explain common tropes, and we provide guidelines on language, law, and ethics, which we've also explained, and support on data and resources. But the key is also that this can be dipped in and out of. It can be used sporadically. You don't need to know every single page of the book in order to find it useful. You can simply look at the reference, find the thing, the index rather, find the thing you want to read, and go from there. Now, I've only got a couple more slides to go. So one of the key things that we try to do, and I tried to make a joke here, but I've discovered that it may not work in Russian, so I'm slightly concerned about this. So one of the things that we try to do as well throughout the book is to ensure that there is improved data literacy, that people understand how to understand data on the issue of migration. And so, you know, where in very simple contexts, such as the pie chart that I've used here, and I understand that it's not called a pie chart in Russian, which means that it may not be as funny as I was hoping it was going to be. You can explain very clear information in very simple terms with the most basic data. But what we've tried to explain in the handbook is how fundamental it is that people understand how data has been collected in order to understand what it actually means. So the key point I think that we make in there is that in order to really understand what the data is that you are dealing with, and in order to interpret it and use it as part of your journalism effectively, it is critical that you understand how a person may have got into that data set in the first place. And unless you do, and so we explain a little bit about the processes, about the differences between, for example, a census versus a survey, this kind of information, but also about how different forms of migration information are collected and why you need to understand that kind of stuff. So we try to do that, and I think that's critical as well in order to avoid problematic understanding of things. And so finally, and I think Tom's going to take over from me in just a minute here, I've just wanted to give you a quick list of the basic chapter headings. Now, each of these chapter headings has multiple subheadings underneath it. But the basic process that we go through is the first chapter deals with the ethical foundations. We then look at the different types of reporters who come across the issue of migration in one way or another, which is effectively everybody. I've already mentioned sports reporters, for example. We deal with arts reporters, but obviously the key things tend to be things like political reporters or people dealing with home affairs or domestic politics or whatever, but also economics, social affairs correspondents, religious affairs correspondents, everybody. So we look at the different ways that people might interact with the issue of migration in different ways, in different environments. We look a little bit about trends in migration reporting. There's a long section dealing with terminology and explaining the complexities of the different language that might be used in different ways. We look at migration stories, so the kinds of stories that appear consistently in the media and how to understand where problems might arise in the interpretation of or the publishing of those things. We look at how to make sure that you actually get stories in the first place, but also get stories right. There's an excellent section which Tom was responsible for, which deals with the process of interviewing people and the complexities of different types of migrant interviews. So, for example, interviewing victims of trauma versus obviously interviewing people about sort of, their economic situation. These are different processes, and one needs to understand these things and understand both media law and sort of the different approaches that you might need to ensure that you both do a good job and also don't involve yourself in the process of re-traumatizing people. A section about how to find and use experts, a section on data and analysis, and then a sort of more deliberative look at how can we strengthen migration reporting in the long run. And then finally, it wraps up with a section on tools and resources in the key countries of the MOMENTA project, as well as some of the key international bodies and people that you can work with on this kind of stuff. So that's me now, and I will pass you over to Tom.
There are two GFMDs. There's the Global Forum for Migration Development, and then there's the Global Forum for Media Development, and I work for the latter. GFMD media rather than migration, but easily confused in the circumstances. So as well as being a media policy advisor for GFMD, I'm also a consultant that does training and other work in journalism support. And as I was engaged by SMPD as an independent consultant for this project, I'm talking on a personal capacity rather than on behalf of GFMD, although I will be bringing in some insights and talking about some of the work that GFMD does later on. I'm going to talk about four things in the 15 minutes, which was 20, but Rob's given me 15 left. And I'm going to talk about, first of all, some aspects of the handbook's methodology and the content that we used. I'm going to talk about the recommendations made to stakeholders. So that was referred to in the strengthening of journalism. How can we do that? I'm going to mention some recent research about mapping activities that aim to improve media coverage of migration and what can be learned from that. And then finally, taking a final step back and looking at how support to journalism in the context of media development on a national and international level, how we can collectively take steps to improve that. Now, one of the things that Rob and I really tried to do, and ICMPD tried to do with this handbook, is to not reinvent the wheel where good resources exist. So you can see that, for example, the Dart Centre for Journalism Trauma. So we referred to and linked to and made sure that in creating this, we were referring journalists to the best resources that exist on interviewing victims of trauma, for example. When it came to ethics and migration guidelines, we took information from the Ethical Journalism Network, the International Journalist Network, the Global Investigative Journalist Network, and for that, I mean, for the Global Investigative Journalism Network, that was more focused on investigations into human trafficking, for example, which would be very different than if you're doing reporting on the economic impacts of migration or reasons for people to moving. And the Media Diversity Institute, looking at issues of diversity and language, and also the Solutions Journalism Network. So we've been talking about, earlier it's been mentioned, the tendency sometimes for media to focus on the negative. Now, the solutions journalism movement really tries to focus on solutions to problems and tell a much more wider story rather than focusing on the negative. And it doesn't mean that you ignore that. It just means that you try and look for potential comparisons with other countries or the neighboring town about how they've dealt with the same policy. And we're very grateful that the Solutions Journalism Network and the Ethical Journalism Network let us republish within the handbook and to translate some of their resources. Now, in terms of misinformation and migration, we also made sure that we weren't reinventing the wheel by information from the Council of Europe on disinformation and migration, from the European Journalism Centre, and from First Draft News in terms of verification and everything else. And also in terms of human rights and that element of it, we've referred to a recent online tool by the European Union's Agency of Fundamental Rights, which I was involved in creating. Also information from the ILO, the IOM, UNHCR, and the Migration Policy Institute. The reason why I want to mention all of this is that often in media support programs that new resources are created for every project. And what we're really trying to do is that for this resource, it doesn't start afresh. It brings insights from ICMPD's work supporting media and Rob and I's collective work, but we really try to use that information, but also to contextualize it. So for example, we would put into the guide the handbook, two different guides on migration reporting, aimed at different audiences, and explain why they're different and their emphasis is different to try and contextualize these kinds of resources. And one example is on the next slide, Rob, if you could just go on to it. So this is a guide on hate speech that the Ethical Journalism Network developed for journalists, but also as a media literacy tool. And it basically helps journalists to ask themselves the right questions when dealing with what language which could be hate speech. And it doesn't focus so much on identifying whether it is or it isn't, because that is, it differs from country to country based on national law. But what it does make sure is that we're asking ourselves the right questions. So for example, who is the speaker? What's their motivation? Should they be listened to or just ignored? So making sure that what we're publishing is newsworthy. We're not being manipulated or not being used as a misinformation or a tool for hate speech. The reach of the speech. So how far is it traveling, and is there a pattern of behavior? The goals of the speech. So does it benefit the speaker and their interests? Rob already mentioned how migration is used as a means to elicit support, especially around elections for different political parties. So as journalists have to be really aware about what is their motivation. Do they benefit from it? It could be that they benefit financially from it if they are a pundit who is actually paid for their appearances, or in fact reflecting on the incentives provided by platforms such as Facebook and others in terms of the kinds of content that their algorithm prefers to share, which creates kind of emotional reactions. Then that's very important to bear in mind. And the content itself, so looking at, what do these images, what do these words mean in different contexts? What are the dog whistles? So words or images that are used that only a specific community will understand what they really mean. Is there violence? Could violence be instigated? And what is the surrounding social, economic, and political climate. And in the handbook, we've given some case studies around how to use this, and provide some guidance about how, if you were to use this as a tool for teaching, educating journalists, how to use this in your own programs and policies. So that's just one example of how we try to use the best of the resources that already exist and to integrate them and make them relevant using case studies from journalists in the region. So Rob mentioned that we really tried to make sure that we're hearing from, and we interviewed many journalists from the Eastern Partnership countries that were taking part, to make sure that these international guidelines and best practice were placed in context. So the handbook gives, the strengthening of migration reporting chapter gives many recommendations. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to focus on the ones that I think are most relevant for those on the call today. So for policymakers and community leaders, one of the things that really is perhaps obvious to say, but media are often led by the dominant narratives that exist in society. And there's a relationship there, but there's a part that can be played by making sure that, you know, fact-based communication, creating space for tolerance and dialogue is absolutely front and center of, you know, public communicators. But also access to accurate and transparent information and data is extremely important. We address this in the handbook in terms of how journalists can interpret it and understand it. But what we found when we're doing the mentoring section of the Momenta program, working with journalists on their stories, they found it really hard to get the data they needed. And, you know, even sometimes submitting freedom of information requests to try and get the data that they required for their stories, and often found this extremely difficult. So one thing that member states can take and institutions can take is to make sure their data is, you know, more transparent, is accurate, and responding to journalist requests when they're asking for information that is in the public interest. The other thing that, from a policymaker's point of view, that I would suggest is to integrate understanding migration into other policy areas, such as media literacy. So looking at how migration is reported in the media, looking at how you know, algorithms and the technology companies respond to migration content on their platforms is really useful for understanding these dynamics. So is there a possibility that we can actually integrate some migration literacy into media literacy efforts that are happening, you know, for secondary schools, for those who are studying media, for example? And the other main point that I'd make is we have to attempt to avoid silos. So when we're thinking about migration and media, we shouldn't separate this from the way that we understand and the way that we try and support journalism and media in general. So just to I'll give some examples of that later, but I think it's really important not to deal with these things separately, because journalism is facing a crisis of finance and a crisis of trust. And so if we're trying to design programs to support journalists, or support journalism, we can't do that in a vacuum. We have to do that understanding that the unbundling of advertising from journalism that the rise of Google and Facebook and others have had means that media is under severe strain. And so we have to, if we want good reporting of migration, we recognize that that is important. We have to recognize that the overall importance of journalism in terms of our theory of change about what a healthy democratic society looks like. Now, the handbook also makes recommendations to press councils and to regulators about how they can be really essential in introducing, you know, good standards and guidelines. But at the same time, we have to recognize that in some jurisdictions, they play a role in censorship as well as rather than a positive one in encouraging good behavior. But there are recommendations about the role that press councils can play, which I'd recommend that are looked at. Now, newsrooms, I mean, I understand our audience is mainly civil servants and states and institutions rather than media, so I won't go into the newsroom recommendations in particular, but just in terms of designing programs that support journalism, you know, we need to make sure that media action encourages, you know, more voices from migrants themselves. study after study shows that they are underrepresented in terms of their actual voice being included. We have to find ways that we can actually get the really good reporting on migration seen by more people and engaged with by more people. So a training that focuses on engagement with audiences, not just producing good journalism, but making sure it reaches and has a wider audience. We all know that online misinformation tends to travel faster than quality information. So how can we resolve that, as well as looking at the legislative and regulation aspects of how the internet is governed. And there are various recommendations on how we can do that better. And one thing I would say, I just want to share a link to a resource that GFMD has just created. It's a fundraising guide for media development and journalism support organizations, but it also includes a media mapping of institutions that support media, not just migration and media, but all kinds of media. So please have a look and help us to update it to make sure it's easier for media organizations who are running media support programs, so that they can actually get the funding that they need and know where to look and know how to apply, if it's at the European Commission or if it's elsewhere. Another thing that's come up in some research mapping that has been done recently is that, you know, things like awards and programs, often there's not an overlap or you know, passing on. Awards happen in a project cycle, migration awards, for example. How can we make sure that they carry on and don't just come and go with the whims of support for these kind of projects? And how can we make sure that you know, engagement of national stakeholders, journalistic institutions, associations, etc. How can we make sure that they take a greater ownership of these processes? Now, if it goes to and just to say that, you know, GFMD is trying to bring together donors who support media programs, such as in this case the German Foreign Office, the implementers of the program, so in this case ICMPD, and researchers and academics, to sit together to talk about how we can design programs for media support that are really effective and that are really value for money, and especially when we're spending taxpayers' money on, you know, within the European Union or externally. You know, how can we make sure this funding is really effective? And in terms of the wider issue about support to journalism, I'd recommend looking at GFMD's emergency appeal, which we published last year, which addresses donors, newsrooms, tech platforms, advertisers, as well as the recommendations from the Council of Europe's Committee on Experts for Quality Journalism to address the systemic and the structural problems that are facing media in order to encourage and incentivize quality journalism, rather than some of the less, you know, some of the journalism that we see about migration that does not live up to the ethical standards that we would hope to see in migration reporting. And to leave time for questions, I'll wrap up there, but I'm very happy to go into more detail about any of these things in the questions. And I'm just now going to post some links to some of the things that I've mentioned and some of the things I didn't have time to mention just now. So.
So I think, Violetta, your point is extremely well made, that public opinion isn't one thing, and often public opinion is much more complex than we can be led to believe by the sort of slightly one-dimensional ways that it's measured and shown to us. So I'll just give you an example. I mean, this is now a little bit old, but about 10 years ago, one of the early pieces of analysis that we did at the Migration Observatory in Oxford was a report called Thinking Behind the Numbers, which was looking at the issue of what people were concerned about migration to the UK, and then challenging them a little bit when we did that. So we asked the question of, okay, do you want to see migration to the UK increased, reduced, or remain about the same? And we asked this question, and the answers that people provided were consistent with all of the previous public attitude studies that have been done in the UK. But then we asked them a question, which is, well, Okay, so looking, for example, at the people who said that they'd like to see migration to the UK reduced, we said, okay, well, so who are you talking about? Which are the groups that you actually mean? So, like, if you'd like to see net migration or migration to the UK reduced, are you looking for this to happen among skilled migrants? Are you looking for this to be purely focused on irregular migration? Are you looking for this to be at lower skilled levels, at lower skilled migration? Are there particular kinds of profession that bother you? And at this point in time, the data in the UK indicated that by far and away, the biggest contributor to net migration was students. But there was almost no media narrative about study migration to the UK. It was broadly considered to be something that was all fine. And so actually, when we asked people this question, that very few, less than a third, identified students as a group that they'd like to see reduced in number to the UK. Very, very, very large number of people, I can't remember the exact proportion, but it was, I think, pushing 3/4, said, well, we're only interested in tackling irregular migration. That's all we care about. And of course, the statistics and the data that we get about migration to the UK don't even include that. So actually, in terms of actually generating change, their focus was very, very firmly on a few key groups, and that was irregular migrants, and it was asylum seekers, which obviously, from that point of view, I mean, international law dictates that you can't control the number of asylum seekers that you're going to receive, and it was low skilled migrants. And at that point in time, this was 10 years ago, this was primarily people from the EU, because there was no route into the UK for people who were working in lower skilled roles other than from the EU. And so what we see in this is that actually this broad picture of something which, this broad picture of kind of anti-migration support was driven by, firstly, a very, very clear media agenda. We knew from our analysis that the point about irregularity was a key thing that was 10 times more likely to be an identifier of migrants in the British press than almost anything else. And we also knew that this issue of irregularity was a key issue. Sorry, not irregularity, rather, of low skilled migration was an issue. And we knew that the issue of students wasn't an issue. So people's actual understanding of the dynamics of migration was driven by quite simplistic, often media-focused narratives that actually didn't necessarily mean anything. So adding complexity to debate is really what I think. So this is just finally, after a bit of a waffling answer, to answer your question. And it's what I think policymakers need to be willing to try to do. It's very, very easy to focus on the simple stories, the sound bites. But adding that complexity means that you actually reach people. People do have nuanced ideas about what they want to see changed. But if they think that the only way that the change is something that is only going to affect things that are big and fundamental, like you either have, it's like a binary, people are either coming in or they're not coming in version of things. You create a world in which policy responses and policymakers' responses end up being blunt instruments, effectively. So I think that really, for me, the key is that if we want to shift public attitudes, we have to complicate debates. And we have to recognize that simple things, simple sort of easy flags that we can wave about migration are in themselves problematic. I think we saw that in the UK very, very, very significantly with this idea about the net migration target, which was a disaster, I think, for thoughtful migration policy making in the UK. And so these kind of, like, as I say, these simplistic approaches need to be avoided, and we need to recognize that we have to go out of our way to complicate issues for the public.
Thanks a lot. I just wanted to build on what Rob's just been saying, because I think there's some very, very cogent points there. I have to say that when it comes to complexity, the issue for me is not whether to do it, but how to do it. How to inject complexity into discussions, and how to make sure that you strike the right balance between informing people properly and still giving them a digestible message. And that's where it very much links to Violetta's point about the different groups and people being at different levels of understanding of the issue, different kind of approaches to it, and therefore being ready to invest more time into understanding it or less time. And in my practice, as it were, I have to say that I'm really struggling with this issue in terms of advising my colleagues in the Commission as to how much complexity to insert into our messaging. That's why in my little intro speech, I was insisting on something much more basic, which is discipline, and I think that's really the basis upon which we need to build as communicators. We first need to get the very, very bare bones of our messaging right, and then in implementing this, we need to go into complexity. And the way I personally, in my experience, tend to deal with this is that in a lot of our public communication as European Commission, we try to focus on a simple message. And that's not because we undervalue complexity or that we try to simplify too much, but actually because even internally, getting internal alignment and agreement on a complex message can be very complicated. It takes a lot of effort. So that's why we tend to try to get to something simple and something that we can communicate in a disciplined way without getting tangled in our messaging. However, as a spokesperson, I spend a lot of time, and really a lot of time, on background with journalists, so speaking completely informally. And there I really do insist on complexity, on sitting down with them, talking them through the data that we have, bringing in all the different aspects and complexity of the topic. There aren't that many journalists who are really willing to make that investment, but those who do, I really value, and I very much encourage all colleagues working on policy to be available to these journalists and really try to work with them. I think this is really one of the hardest problems that we have as communicators on migration, is to striking this balance between accuracy and complexity on the one hand, and simplicity and digestibility.
Really important question, and my answer is that these questions have to be dealt with at a national level and sometimes at a regional level, but because the language and meaning changes, and what a migrant means today, it will have different connotations tomorrow. We saw this with Al Jazeera deciding to call people moving across the Mediterranean all migrants, not calling them refugees, because refugees, or they call them all refugees rather than migrants, because they thought the migrant had become toxic, right? Mm. So that was a choice they made in their newsroom. But how to resolve this, I would recommend, and I've just posted my answer to Michelle, is we need to replicate things like the Carta di Roma, the Charter of Rome in Italy, where they brought together newsrooms, journalist associations, civil society to discuss these complex issues and form a glossary, which was then adopted and is used as the basis for training. Now, if we can go one step further and also incorporate regulatory bodies, press councils in that conversation, and then we can get newsrooms, publishing groups, journalist associations, civil society, and the press regulators to agree on terms and try to agree when you should use them, and try to have this discussion about when they're problematic, etc. Then that will be much more effective than an international organization publishing some guidelines. We have to have a process where people discuss their concerns, they are heard, and they own that initiative, and it becomes adopted within national press council guidelines, within newsrooms, within public service broadcasters. But we have to create media development assistance that involves all of those actors and brings them on the journey to collectively agree on the set of terms and understand the nuances of language and culture which evolve over time. So the other thing about glossaries is we can't do them once. We have to make sure that they are constantly updated to adapt to the evolution of language and migration, and how migration changes.
Because I completely agree with Tom that, like, ideally you would want to have a proper discussion of this and an agreement and something that works in different linguistic and cultural contexts and political contexts that's well thought through. But in our practice as the European Commission, we communicate in 24 languages, and we have to somehow use words and terms that work, that can be translated, that work across all of these different concepts. And that is a particular difficulty that I think some of us face. And on that, the reflection that we've had so far is that probably the second best, compared to the approach that Tom outlined, is to just try to be as simple as possible and as how can I put this, as not jargony as possible. What this means is that when talking about migration, the safest bet in using terms is to come down to people as the kind of basic unit of the phenomenon that you're describing. So even when we have discussions with colleagues about the use of words like migrant, refugee, or a minor, for example, is also a frequent topic. We tend to advise, if you don't have a good question, get a good term, get down to people who do this, people who migrate, people who escape this, people who have arrived. These kinds of terms, and if you try to be as basic as that, at least you end up avoiding characterization that's inherent in what you're saying. But yeah, that you can't always do it, and indeed, there's just no simple solution to this.
One piece of work that I can point people towards on that, which I think is worth a look, is the Reminder project, which was a piece of work that was commissioned by as part of the Horizon 2020 work, and that was run by the Centre on Migration Policy and Society, but we worked with ICMPD and a number of other people on that. And there's a substantial chunk of that which is focused on public attitudes towards migration. It's a good, solid piece of internationally comparative analysis looking across the EU. It looks at migration into the EU as well from third countries, but that's a good piece of work. And the work of Scott Blinder at the University of Massachusetts Amherst on public attitudes is very good, and Will Allen as well, who's somebody who I do a bit of work with. So they do a lot of work on public attitude stuff, and it's pretty good. So, and the European Social Survey as well. Sorry.
If I could quickly add to that, Rob. So from a policymaker's point of view, what would be really valuable is support to the institutions who are doing this research on public opinion, on media and migration, because also supporting that research done at universities and other institutions is really valuable, because what it allows us to do is to show trends and to show, if not correlation, but a correlation rather than causation. But it allows, if we're talking with a newsroom, for example, as a media trainer, like I do sometimes, and we're talking about negativity, and say that, maybe the balance is wrong here, if I have evidence to show that their institution or the national, at the national level, there's this imbalance between coverage of negative versus positive versus constructive or neutral, that gives me much more of a chance to engage with them about actually what could be done differently, and maybe the editorial policy has to be adapted in some way. So support to that kind of research is really important, and that's something that policymakers can choose to do if they want to support this work. Yes, well, there can be political or business reasons to actually deliberately take a negative view or frame migration from a negative perspective. I guess, one thing that I would say is that there's a lot of discussion around, regulation and legislation around the platforms that are used to by many media to communicate. And if we can do something to address the incentives, that clickbait sensationalism is valued higher than quality public service journalism via these mediums that media can newsrooms have to now largely use to reach their audience. If we can do something to address those incentives and to reverse them, then we'll make some progress, I think, in terms of reversing those incentives. It's a much bigger question. It's one that is a big headache for us who deal in media policy and media assistance. And I'd love to have a much longer conversation about it with you, because I don't think we have time to go through all details today, but I am going to post a link to where at GFMD we're trying to bring together donors, policymakers, academics, and those who actually conduct media support to discuss how we can effectively support media, including migration reporting, but support media in general, and how we can deal with these very complicated issues. So I'm going to post a link in the chat now, as well as my email address, and I hope we can continue.
I think it's really important to remember that there's not one acceptable position on how migration should be managed. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate for people to be skeptical about migration, particularly specific levels of migration. And there's no fundamental problem with journalism that focuses on that even is supportive of kind of restrictionist perspectives on migration. And I think that with the handbook, we've tried to make sure that we're even-handed about this, and we don't try and tell people what sort of perspective that they should take on this. The key is that the one thing that has to underpin everything is accuracy and honesty, and I think that if we can ensure that all reporting on migration comes from a place of of agreed facts that actually are real and that aren't based on fabrication, then we're in a pretty solid position. And it's not up to me to dictate to people what they should think about an issue. And I think that, broadly speaking, I mean, that's pretty much, I mean, where I would come from on this. My own position is irrelevant. It's up to other people to make their own minds up about stuff.
Just to agree with Rob's point, indeed, there's lots of different perspectives, and we need a healthy policy debate, which can mean different perspectives. The key, indeed, is accuracy and balance, and for that, again, our role as policymakers is to supply the data, the understanding, the perspectives that are needed for people to make their own minds in an accurate way. But there's maybe one more aspect that I think is important in this discussion, in terms of how migration is reported. That's a kind of respectful attitude, because I think it's one thing to have a negative framing, to point to difficulties, problems, and even advocate pretty radical policy solutions. That's all fine. But I think a certain line is crossed if people are being demonized or blamed unfairly or characterized in ways that are just not accurate. And this is where when I speak to journalists and I hear them kind of use loaded terms which cross that line, I tend to point it out, and I tend to, in general, even in written replies, say, these are not terms that I would use for these and that reasons. And I think that's just a small thing that we can do to avoid giving the impression that in interactions with people who use sometimes these disrespectful offloaded terms, we tacitly endorse them. I think it's really important to be quite clear about that. It's kind of common basis of basic kind of human values.
I've got a quick answer to that.
Yeah.
I don't know about which is the strongest or the weakest, but I know which is the easiest for individuals to affect, which is the media side of things. It's much to change public attitudes is a complicated thing, and to try and go in and actively affect the way that the public is thinking about things, you need tools. And similarly with policymakers, I mean, unless you're, I mean, obviously if you are, I mean, a lot of people that we have here are civil servants, But unless you're actually part of government, it's very challenging to bring about policy change or to drive those kinds of things. But as an individual or as a small organization, it's quite straightforward. And I mean, Adalbert was talking about using strategic approaches to changing things. It's quite straightforward to reach out to journalists and to drive new ways of thinking about things, new ways of talking about things through intelligent and thoughtful interventions, or sometimes through less intelligent and less thoughtful interventions that happen to chime with people. But so I think that strength, if you mean strength in terms of driving change, I think media is really, really important. Obviously, the other two are possibly stronger in terms of making it really happen, but media is something that more people can affect.
Just very quickly by saying that one of those parts of the triangle is undergoing an existential threat in terms of, funding to public service broadcasting, in terms of the business models that media have used to fund journalism. So it's, as I understand, I would argue that, and I think most people on this call would agree, that a free and independent media that holds government to account, that scrutinizes migration policy among everything else, is an essential part of a functioning society. And we need to find policies that support that part of the triangle to produce quality journalism, not to chase clickbait. We need to find policies in a variety of ways to make sure that they are able to perform that function. And I've put some links about policy suggestions that cover a wide range of issues about how we can do that. But I think we should focus on trying to support quality public service media, because it is under threat everywhere in the world, and we have to do something to address that urgently. Otherwise, that influence will be much more likely to be influenced by politics or influenced by the incentives of chasing sensational stories, clickbait, etc. So we have to address that urgently. Otherwise, media won't perform that function in any kind of constructive way for society.